In this video, I want to demonstrate a little exercise that I've recently created, which I'm calling the Untangled Conditionals Kata. The idea is that you take this piece of code and it's got a load of tangled conditionals, or rather multiple levels of ifs and elses, and you try and untangle them to create more readable and understandable code. I'm going to use a specific approach to do this. This approach involves actually making the code look a little bit worse before we start making it better. So normally we try to avoid duplication, we try to avoid deep levels of nested ifs and elses. But in this case, I'm going to start by adding those things in and getting us to a state where I can actually start to refactor and make things better. There's certain types of code that I think is suitable for this kind of approach, and this is a kind of example of it. So the thing that you will notice here is that we've got these variables here, these sort of internal states in this function, and they get updated as you go down through this code. Now there are sequential if statements here, and each one of these has like more if statements inside, and these are often like rechecking these variables here. So as these variables get updated in certain places, and then they're checked again later on in other places. So what we've got is we've got this kind of long drawn out piece of code which is sort of doing the same check multiple times and manipulating state along the way. So often when you get a piece of code like this, it's tempting to start extracting methods or extracting variables or something like that to try and get some sense of understanding. Maybe also trying to eliminate the else statements, get some guard clauses in there with some early returns, this kind of thing. But actually, I find when I try and do that with this code, I end up taking quite a long path trying to get to where I want to get to. I kind of break out lots of small functions, but I still feel tangled and not quite sure where I'm meant to be going with it. So I want to use a slightly different approach here. So the first thing I want to notice here is that we've got these three if statements that follow one after another. And you'll see that in these if statements, they're setting this test pass variable. So it might be setting it to true or false, and then it's checking it in various stages later on. Now I could try and reason about this, but what I'm going to try and do instead is I'm going to just try and bring these if statements closer to where the values are being set. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to take this second if statement and I'm going to start to duplicate it into the other one. But before I do that, let's just run the tests to make sure they work. So these tests are included in the repository, so you get these out of the box if you download it and want to try this Kata yourself. So the tests are passing. I'm going to copy this one or cut this one out here, and I'm going to paste it into the else here, but I'm also going to paste it into here. So previously we did the if, and then we fell down and we performed the second if. But now what I'm doing is I'm taking that and I'm duplicating it into both places. So we've got it here and here. So we're sort of basically saying if something is true, do this thing, else do the same thing. Obviously after the specialized bit of logic that comes in front of there. So if we run that, the tests still pass. So all we've done really is duplicated code. We haven't really achieved anything particularly interesting, but we can see here already that IntelliJ is telling us that if there's something wrong with this if statement here, and the reason is that this if statement is calling if test pass, but in the line above we can see that it's set as true, so it's always going to be true. So this will always run, this can never happen. So thankfully IntelliJ helps us here and it lets us unwrap that particular if because it can't be reached. So if I run the test again, we can see it's still passing. Now that hasn't achieved much. The code is still longer and possibly messier than it was originally, but we can see that we've got something similar going on here. So we've got these two cases here where test pass is being set to a value, and then after that's happened, test pass is being checked. So let's cut that code out here, paste it in here and here. So again, we've duplicated the code, we've moved it into the branches on both sides, so it's always being called. So we run the tests again and we can see that they're passing. Again, we can now see that IntelliJ has flagged up that there are branches in these if statements that are no longer or can never be reached. So here we can see this one is set to true, so only this one can be run. So again, we can just use IntelliJ to fix this issue. Same again here, this is false, so now it's only the else condition that ever gets run. So again, we can just ask IntelliJ to remove the unreachable branch. We run the test and we're still green. So that's one step. I would argue that the code doesn't really look any better, potentially a little bit worse. Now we can do the same with this remaining if statement below. So let's do the same thing here. So let's start by just moving it in to the first level. So here and here. We can run the test. So always running the test to make sure that we're keeping the code working all the time. But again, still, this is still an if statement that's sequentially following after other if statements. So let's repeat the action again and move that in, so even more duplication. So that can come into here and here. We can run the tests again. And let's see if we can do the same up here. So we can cut it out from here and we can paste it into here. And let's go straight away into these branches as well. So we run the tests again. Everything is passing and we've got what I would argue is a horrible mess of code. But importantly, I've been doing this fairly robotically. I've not really been thinking too much about what the code does. I've just been moving the structure around. We can see that IntelliJ is now highlighting lots of areas where we've got unreachable branches. So let's just go through and remove them all. So we can remove that one, got another one here. We have another one here. And there. And here. So now we're seeing something else. So now IntelliJ is saying that these variables are no longer being used. So we're not actually saving this state for later on now. We're sort of calling the actions that are dependent on it immediately. So let's just remove these. They're gone. Now we've just got this piece of code left. Now this looks pretty messy, but what we've got is we've just got one top level if statement, and then everything else is just embedded levels of if statements, if and else. So we've got every branch is sort of complete. And we can see that there's a lot of repetition in here now, specifically this block here. We can see this everywhere. So now we can look at this and we can say, right, what's this doing? Well, it's saying if the send summary config option is set, then we're going to send an email. Otherwise, we're just going to log out that the email sending is disabled. So I'm going to call this, I'm going to extract a method and I'm going to call it send email. So let's do it, send email. Or we could call it send email summary to make it line up with the name in the config. And now we can see that IntelliJ has spotted that actually some of these versions are a little bit different, so they have different messages in there, and it's asking us if we want to make this a little bit more, or make the method that we're extracting a little bit more generic. So let's accept that, and now we can extract lots and lots of instances of that little block of code. So here's our new method down here. Let's give the parameter a decent name. There we go. So now this code is for the first time starting to look a little bit more better than it was originally. So maybe we're getting somewhere. So now let's look at this code in a little bit more depth. We can see again that we've got another piece of repetition here. So we've got this one here and here. So we could extract this out. We could say extract this out into a method as well. But before I do that, I'm noticing that there's something interesting here, which is that both of these blocks kind of happen at the end of the branch that they're in. So maybe if this one here happens at the end and this one here happens at the end, maybe we can just move the two below so that they're outside of this if condition altogether. Now if I'm going to do that, I've got to look here. We've got one other branch here which doesn't have this block of code in it. So if we're going to do that, we're going to have to make sure that this block of code never falls through. So we can do that by turning this into a guard clause. So if we invert this if statement Then we get that at the top, and we can call return here. Yeah, test should still pass. And we've now got this else statement here, which is actually redundant because the function now returns in the other branch. We can just get rid of this else and just call this code regardless. So we run the code again, see it's all still passing. And now we've got something here where we've got this outer if statement, and in both the if and the else, the last action is this block of code. It's the same block of code in both places. So let's take it out of the if statement altogether. Like so, and hopefully we run the tests and we can see they still pass. So things are getting a lot better. Now let's try and actually work out what these things are doing and give them some proper names. So this thing here, if the project has the tests, then it's going to run the tests. Okay, so this is running some tests. Here, if we've got no tests, I guess it's not running the tests, but it is still falling through. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all of this and I'm going to extract it out into a method. Let's just call it run tests. Okay, so this is called run test. It runs the test, but we've noticed here that it is returning. So it's returning if this returns true. So if this returns true, it returns true here when the test failed. So maybe this is a bad name. Shouldn't be called run test. Maybe this is called tests failed. So if tests failed, return. That makes some sense. Okay, now let's see what this one does here. So this is saying if project deploy, output a message, otherwise output a message to say it's failed. So I think I'm going to take this out as a method as well, but let's just extract the whole thing for starters. So we can say let's call it deploy. There we go. So we're saying if test failed, return, else deploy. Okay, let's have a look into these methods down here and see if we can tidy them up a bit. So I'm not particularly a fan of else statements, so maybe we can turn these into guard clause so these functions focus on what they're doing. So I think if this is called deploy, then I guess I want the success case to be the kind of final return. So I'm going to turn the error case into a guard clause. So if we say we invert the if condition, we say return here, again we can run the tests, and then we can say remove redundant else statement. There we go. And what have we got down here? So we've got something similar here. I think often when we've got an if statement where the main body is kind of quite big and then the second part of it is a bit smaller, then maybe that suggests that we can flip it round. Keep pressing the wrong button. There we go, invert, and we do a return. What do we return this time? So here it's going to be, what was it returning previously? It was falling through to the false, so we want to return false. So let's flip that round. Let's say return false. We can remove the redundant else. There we go. And we've got here, so we're saying if the project has no tests, then log it out and return false. So false means that the tests have passed, because this is test failed. That's a little bit confusing. Maybe we can think about the name again in a minute. But okay, so if this one false, so this is when they failed. So here it returns true to say the tests have failed, otherwise tests have passed. Okay, I'm going to leave that as it is for a minute, see if we can tidy it up in a moment. Again, down here in the send email summary, again, I think I want the sending of the email to be the kind of main action, so I'm going to turn the else clause into the guard clause. go. Cool, so that all makes sense. Now there's something that I'm not too keen on here. I'm not too keen on having these emails being sent throughout all of these different levels. The logs I'm okay with because I can see that different things are going on, but the emails, I can see that they're sort of being strung through all the tests, so maybe we can kind of make this initial run function a little bit more, or separate the order with the sending of these emails maybe. So we could say if test failed, what do we want to do? Oh sorry, here's the if test failed. So here we go, we've got if test failed, then we want to send out the email. So let's put that here. Take that out there, put that here on the tests. Great, that's still green, and then we can do the same here. So we've got the deploy. So let's go for the same kind of approach. So let's say that here we've got it returning if there's a failure early. So let's make this return true. So let's go with the same approach here. Actually, let's call this if deploy failed. And then we can say if deploy failed, return. There we go. Now we can see there's a problem here because this is Boolean, so let's make this, or rather because it's void, let's make it into a Boolean. And then this return is going to have to return something. So here, if it's failed and the deploy's failed, okay, let's make that return true. And then I guess it will return false. Okay, all good. So now we can move these out. So if it's failed, we can say send an email like so. Otherwise, let's send the final success one at the bottom of the run method and tidy up a little bit. And there we have it. So I'm going to leave it at this point. You could start extracting things out into other classes, or there might be other design choices that you might want to make. But at this point, it's much more easy to comprehend what this function is doing, or what this class now is doing. So the key takeaway from this, if you're doing this exercise, is try using duplication and bringing the different if statements together first before trying to extract different methods, and it gets you to this place, I think, a lot quicker than if you start just trying to extract things right from the beginning. I hope you find it useful.